Regulated.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages, casino gaming, and tobacco. Now together, we're regulated.
This week, Regulated is examining the coronavirus crisis and the resulting mitigation efforts from a legal perspective. Across the country, states and local governments have enacted a patchwork of regulations and stay-at-home orders that affect commerce, institutions, and individuals. And today, Tony and I have a guest to talk about some of the legal and practical issues drawn from news stories emerging around the country.
I think we have the perfect guest for this discussion. We're thrilled to be joined by Professor Anthony Krice, who's a visiting assistant professor at the Chicago-Kent School of Law. Professor Krice joined the Chicago-Kent faculty back in 2016 from the University of Georgia, where he also completed a PhD in political science and public administration. Professor Krice also earned a law degree from Washington and Lee University School of Law, where, to be candid, he ruined the curve for a bunch of normal guys like me. If you're smart, you'll join the over 14,000 people who follow him on Twitter at Anthony M. Krice. That's K-R-E-I-S, Anthony M. Krice, for his timely takes on constitutional law, civil rights, and current events. Don't take my word for it. Even a celebrity like Chrissy Teigen is a fan. He got a pretty high-profile retweet a few months ago that we probably should ask him about.
Professor Krice is going to get a Quibi show.
Right.
By way of congratulations for things that aren't related to Chrissy Teigen, Professor Krice recently announced that he's going to be joining the Georgia State Law faculty in a tenure-track position to teach constitutional law. So welcome to the show, Professor Krice. We're very excited to talk to you about basically the topic of our lives from the past month.
No, thanks for having me, and look forward to our conversation.
Well, let's start off with the Florida man story, since Christian and I are both based in the Sunshine State, but this one has a constitutional nexus. We discussed this last week, but a Tampa area megachurch pastor was recently arrested for violating his local safer at home order after packing in 500 people at a Sunday service. The pastor ended up turning himself in to face charges of unlawful assembly and violating a public health emergency rule. And now there is some question now about whether those charges will stand, because there's been a conflicting and potentially superseding order from the governor. So there's been some misunderstandings and misapprehension about the constitutionality of restricted church services. You know, Anthony, as a constitutional law professor, I'd love to get your perspective. Why are governments allowed to restrict these religious gatherings under the Constitution?
Yeah, so I think, there's been this misunderstanding in the last particularly like 10 years that religious objectors have some kind of special right, particularly a special constitutional right, to exempt themselves and kind of become a law unto themselves simply because they have a religious objection to some secular order, right? And the truth of the matter is that as a constitutional matter, religious entities and religious organizations and pastors have actually very little wiggle room to object to rules which we consider to be general and neutral and applicable to everybody, right? So if I have a rule that says everybody must do X, Y, and Z in order to prevent a public health crisis from ballooning, you as a religious objector to that rule don't have some special dispensation under the Constitution to be granted to you simply because you object. So there's two big things here, right? There's a long history, particularly about public health and the Constitution, which I think we need to recognize or at least gesture to or talk about. So there's an early 1900s case called Jacobson, and it was this clergyman in Massachusetts who refused to be vaccinated for smallpox because he didn't want it, said that it violated his liberty interests. And during this period, there's a mass acute smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts. So he gets fined, and then he brings his case, and he goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, no, right? You can't refuse to be vaccinated for something because your refusal isn't just a personal liberty interest, it actually has third-party harms, right? So his refusal to be vaccinated causes the community greater harm, it's not a closed universe. And the same principle applies here, right? You cannot claim that there's no harm that's being done by having these church services and the like. Now, I think there's on the flip side, Florida has an interesting constitutional question because by expressly exempting religious gatherings, there's now a new constitutional problem that would not have existed if the governor created an order that just applied to everybody, on the same footing. So now there's an establishment clause question because what if if I was a member of the Florida Democratic Party or the Florida Republican Party or Florida Libertarian Party, wanted to have a political gathering of 50 people or something like that. If that's not permissible under the regulation, right, under the order, but someone can have a religious service under the same conditions, that now presents an establishment clause violation problem. So I think it's really important, just in terms of both a good public health policy practice, but just as a good constitutional practice, to create rules that apply to everybody neutrally, right? You don't get these special exemptions or exceptions for religious practices or for political practices. Everybody's held to the same standard, of course, with the exception of those businesses which are deemed absolutely essential to right, the public's functioning and continued order.
Well, from a practical perspective, do you think there is any safe way to hold a religious gathering during this period of social distancing?
No, I mean that's right. That's the problem, right? What folks aren't recognizing is that when 25% of, and I don't want to play armchair epidemiologist here, but when 25% of people are asymptomatic for the entirety of their shedding the virus, and they're still a contagion risk, that's problematic. And when there's these services also just don't seem to be adhering to social distancing norms. I don't know if that's particularly true in the Florida cases, but if you look at the Louisiana cases, I mean, there are pictures of some of these services where people are clearly not abiding by basic 6 foot, social distancing norms, not wearing masks, not taking those extra precautions. To me, the better thing is, right, that you don't want to prevent churches and synagogues and mosques and all the rest from giving their congregants the services that they really should have in time of crisis. There are ways you can do it, right? You can have virtual services and still permit people in small groups of 2 or 3 or 4 to run that and then project that. It's not a good fix, or it's not a perfect fix, but it's a way that you can still maintain, right, a relationship with your congregants without risking their health, your health, or the health of the broader community.
Yeah, I think there's a perception across the country, and certainly in this region, that the virus isn't already here. And just the 2 data points I have from personal experience, there was a confirmed exposure within a 10-minute drive of my daughter's daycare way back on March 16th, right? That was just uncovered this weekend. We're recording this on April 7th. So the virus is, at least in terms of my neighborhood, the virus has been in my neighborhood for quite some time. And I have a family member who was exposed and lives in rural northern Louisiana, about an hour outside of Shreveport, is an elderly gentleman. And, he wasn't traveling. He wasn't in New Orleans partying on Bourbon Street. So it shows that even in these remote areas and even in these suburban communities without, a strong international hub, that the virus is already among us. So it's a matter of it really is preventing the spread because it's already spread to our communities.
Right. I mean, even if you want to take an example of a gathering of that kind of flavor, which created mass contagion, you don't have to look that far from Florida. You can just go to Albany, Georgia, right? They've had Albany, Georgia's Phoebe Medical Centers had one of the highest infection rates and death rates in the country. I mean, a few weeks ago, they were number 3. And it all started because someone came to Albany for a funeral service and spread it at a funeral service, and it just swept the community like wildfire. And of course, there too, as is with so many of these communities, and again, I've talked about this before about communities, rural communities, particularly in the deep South, in Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, and the rest. A lot of the underlying health conditions which exacerbate this disease are present in those communities. And so not only are these rural communities at extreme risk because of the fact that there's been a lack of public health infrastructure there for decades, and it has gotten worse in recent years, but this particular disease will acutely affect those kinds of conditions that people in the region have. And so I think it is important that, and again, especially in this religious context, that pastors take the care of their flock they should be. But I don't want to also just put it all on the shoulders of pastors and religious leaders and the like, because the truth of the matter is that government officials have a duty here too, right? They have a duty to create clear, understandable, easily digestible, generally applicable rules, and they have a duty to explain them and to explain them to the public and the rationale behind them, and they have a duty to have them easily enforced. And that is the problem that I see, right, particularly in Florida, right, where on one hand you get the order from Governor DeSantis that says one thing, and then a couple of days later you hear, well, localities can do more if they want, but the order doesn't suggest that localities can actually do more than right, the superseding executive order. And then you have confusion both at the local government level, but you also have confusion for folks who might feel enabled or somehow empowered to now create have these gatherings. So it's important to have a unified, cohesive, coherent message that people can understand and apply and follow.
Yeah, I was confused by that action too, because of the timing of it. The timing of that exception came, what, Tony, like 2 days after the Hillsborough pastor was arrested,
Right.
And so it'd be one thing if the decision was made from the state government, and then local governments kind of had to figure it out, right? But we, as a state, didn't make an overarching decision, and so for like 10 days, 2 weeks before, you had local government, specifically like Miami-Dade, Broward County, like the Southeast Florida was having to kind of cobble together their own policies. And so there were like existing shelter-in-place orders, like existing regs on the books with teeth to prevent church services from happening, as kind of this mosaic approach that they were different all over the state, but some of these existed. And it seemed like the way it was at least reported was that this was superseding, was that this directly contravened what those local governments did. And because of the preemption leaning state government that Florida has, well, a lot of local governments were just like, oh, I guess we can't do this anymore. Tony, maybe you can answer this too, because I've looked for this, what the specific argument was, because Governor DeSantis, he's quoted as saying government does not have the authority to close a church. But I haven't actually seen what the legal basis for saying that they don't have the authority to close a church was. Have you seen that? Or maybe Professor Kreis, maybe you can agree or disagree with that statement.
I'm just going to straight up say I don't know what I wouldn't know what he's talking about, right? In the legal academy world, like, we require a footnote and a citation for everything, and that would not have a footnote nor a citation because it doesn't exist, right? Religious organizations and entities don't get a free pass. Now, you can't target them either, right? So there's actually a great case out of Florida, actually, about targeting religion and how we have a different kind of standard when you target religion for constitutional analysis. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the government is saying we have a global pandemic, we have a global health crisis. These are the general rules that everyone has to abide for a temporary period. There is no targeting of religion. And I think that's perfectly constitutional and will withstand constitutional scrutiny. What you wouldn't be able to do is say, right, I'm going to have a different rule that penalizes religious people because I just don't want them gathering. And right, that would be both unconstitutional and anti-constitutional in the sense of, like, it would be biased against religious individuals and people of faith. But that's just not what's happening here. So what the consequence of the order now is you have a special rule for religious people that does not apply to others who have similarly important political and other kind of free speech interests. And that, I think, presents a whole different constitutional challenge, which would not have existed but for that exception. And I've said this before, and I think it's worth saying again. I don't think this is a legal question. This is a political one, because what's happening here is a question of whether the governor wants to tell, I think, frankly, his base the hard truth about what needs to be done to stem the tide of this pandemic. But the sad consequences is that the only thing that's lost is lives here, right? That they just need a neutral rule that applies to everybody, and that's fair, that's constitutional, and that's consistent with religious liberty practices.
The one thing I've seen cited is Florida's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and
Right.
it basically it's not a long statute, but the statute is that the government cannot substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, and that also says even if that burden results from a rule of general applicability, but then, it goes on to say that there's an out clause, so you can do it if there's a compelling government interest and it's the least restrictive means possible, which seems in a pandemic, that bar for what the least restrictive mean is possible, because obviously it's a compelling government interest. It seems like it goes up a little bit.
Right, but and I think that's the importance of permitting exceptions for small groups, right? So if you say that you can still have a group of 5 people, right, and that applies to everybody no matter what, that still permits that, hopefully, that a church or synagogue or a mosque or whatever to have virtual services to the extent possible, or to create different right. So you're not clamping down on religious practice, and you're not stamping it out, and you're not saying no, you can't do anything. It's just you have to do this in a particular way for the next month or so, right? And I do not think, right, and this actually goes back to, I think, judicial decision-making practices and kind of theories, but no court, no matter what, is going to question a public health order in a time of a global pandemic. And there's some good to that, and there's a lot of potential bad in that, but that's just a simple reality. I don't think you're going to get any court to buy into a argument that they need to step in and enjoin this kind of order now when it's so temporary, and they'll kick it out for analysis after the fact.
I look at it as almost a false choice with this religious freedom issue, right? Where you have the choice, this kind of binary choice between, okay, we don't have the freedom to suppress religion. I mean, we don't have the ability as a government to suppress religion, but at the same time, if we do, and then we have to, it's very Machiavellian, and we have to shut the whole thing down. But to me, that doesn't seem to exist in the world we're living in, because if you look at almost every other constitutionally protected freedom we have, whereas we're delaying elections right now, we're shutting down public commerce, we're shutting down public meetings, all the things which are protected by the Constitution. But there's this one thing that allows these, again, not to harp on it, but there is no more ubiquitous social function in the country where you have small, like, groups of old people meeting together in a room continuously. There's no other thing that exists other than organized religion. And going back to what you said earlier, can you talk about some of the issues that raises when you shut all of these other constitutionally protected things down, but you expressly allow for this religious carve out?
Yeah, I mean, I of course, I don't want to discount, right, anyone's view of what is sufficient for, right, their religious practice. But, I think when the balance has to be struck between giving up being, in-person services for a month versus mass casualties, that's not a hard choice when there's that alternative. And we, historically, and you mentioned the Spanish flu in 1918, history doesn't look kindly on those who don't take the proactive measures and cause mass casualties as a consequence, right? So I often talk about and it's come up again in the context of this crisis, but the 1918 Philadelphia parade, the Liberty Parade, which 200,000 people, right, packed downtown Philadelphia, even though the Port of Philadelphia started to be a cluster of Spanish flu spread. That spreads, and within 48 hours or so, or 72 hours of the parade, Philadelphia's hospitals are completely overrun and at capacity, and over 4,000 people died within 2 weeks of that parade because of that parade. Meanwhile, St. Louis and some other bigger cities enforced social distancing, interrupted public life, did take those kinds of measures, which were uncomfortable and unpleasant and hard, no doubt, but they stemmed the tide of the epidemic, and were able to flatten the curve of this, the influenza in 1918. Who wants to be Philadelphia today? I would hope nobody. And unfortunately,
well, right, Bill de Blasio would like a word, but
Brian Kemp too, I'm sure. But the problem is right, Bill de Blasio, Brian Kemp, All these governors and mayors, I think, need to understand, and I mean, it's really not them at this point. It's just a few holdouts that are really, really left. I think what they need to understand is that it's better to be, you're never really acting ahead of the curve. You're always actually behind the curve. And so everything you do will probably seem to be draconian and excessive. But that's something that we will look back later and say, well, I'm glad we were too harsh. And as opposed to looking back and saying, well, we should have done more. And that's just the reality of the situation we're in.
Moving from religion, so we have some very colorful individualistic stories that have been popping up around the country. And one of the stories that caught me and Tony's eye, we talked a little bit off air, was one out of Kentucky, where it was this very, very colorful 53-year-old man from Nelson County in Kentucky that the governor basically got on TV and said, we're forcing isolation upon this unnamed 53-year-old man because he was diagnosed with coronavirus and refused to self-isolate. And so, the governor is very sober about it. He's like, I never thought I'd have to do this. I never wanted to do this, but we're basically going to force this man into isolation. So I think everyone agrees with the fundamental purpose of the action, which is to take this individual who refuses to self-isolate and force him to isolate. But if you decontextualize it, it can seem to some people a little bit 1984-esque. So from a legal perspective, can you talk a little bit about what the government power is to forcibly isolate an individual that refuses to isolate themselves if they cause a public harm?
So I think this actually goes back to the Jacobson vaccination case, right? We really do give the government tremendous power to mandate public health orders or to enforce public health orders, including vaccination. So not only did you have the Jacobson case, but there was later a case called Zook, where there was a San Antonio school district which didn't allow children to enroll in the school district unless they were vaccinated for smallpox. And that's a totally constitutional rule. There's no constitutional right to not be vaccinated if it's so mandated by the government. So the same kind of thing applies here. The government has a long history of enforcing quarantine orders and isolation orders. One of them being, we could go back for a long time, but there are certainly restrictions on those, right? If they're overbroad. So there's a case in Brooklyn from the early 1900s where a lot of these cases popped up, where everyone was required to either self-isolate or get vaccinated, even for smallpox. But court struck it down because there was no evidence that smallpox was a present risk. They're kind of discriminatory in a racially biased way, right? Courts will strike those down. But barring some kind of really egregious, calculus like that, courts aren't going, especially if someone's been diagnosed with something, courts are not going to intervene. Your due process rights will not have been violated because the truth of the matter is you're a public health risk. And for, especially, and it might be different if we were talking about like some kind of very long-term quarantine, right? On balance, what we're talking about here is people who are being asked to stay at home for 14 days to maybe a month, and that's not something courts are going to say is unreasonable given the circumstances. So certainly I think individuals who want to challenge those have a due process right to challenge those orders, but they're going to lose, and they should lose, because it's just so grossly irresponsible to not self-isolate voluntarily.
Well, what about the right to travel aspect of this? So where I'm broadcasting from today, I'm probably about 20 miles away from a state border checkpoint. And I know the governor of Maine has warned New Yorkers against traveling to their houses, their vacation homes in that state. And there's some other discussions in other states and border conflicts going on as well. What are your thoughts from a constitutional perspective on that dynamic?
There's a case for a lot of these cases are very old, but there is a case from the early 1900s about the capacity of states to enforce these kinds of broad orders which restrict interstate travel. And the long story short of it is there was a ship with both foreign and domestic citizen passengers that left France and Italy and was going to New Orleans in 1898, and the ship is expected for a contagion, is cleared, gets to New Orleans, and they're refused to be let out and into the city because the city creates a absolute quarantine because in the process as the ship was coming upriver, they had discovered a few cases of yellow fever, and it was the second wave of an outbreak that had cost 300 lives the year before. And the Supreme Court just said, yeah, you quarantine orders and things like that will absolutely impinge on the right to travel and interstate commerce, but it's well within the state's prerogative, barring a federal law superseding it, to enact it. And there is no federal law right on the books even now to supersede state action like that. The touchstone question in this analysis is really, it's derived, I think, from a late 1990s case called Science, where the Supreme Court said the right to travel hinges on a few things. One of them, probably the most relevant for now, is that residents or non-residents are welcomed in states on essentially equal footing as residents. So what you note is that these state governors have not banned out-of-state residents outright. What they have said is if you are traveling from a particular jurisdiction, no matter whether you are like in Rhode Island, right? If you're coming from New York, whether you're a Rhode Island resident or whether you're a New Yorker, you still have to self-isolate no matter what for 14 days, and then you're free to go on your business. Now, that is completely constitutional and consistent with a lot of Commerce Clause, right to travel case law. What I think is less, or perhaps maybe more suspect, in Delaware, there's an order for State Patrol to pull over essentially any out-of-state vehicle that's not on an interstate road, and then to kind of question and interrogate them about where they're coming from, where they've been, are they self-isolating alike. I think that raises some Fourth Amendment problems, which I can't really speak to as a non-expert on the Fourth Amendment, but there's certainly, at least from a right to travel perspective, it seems to strike me as a little aggressive to pull everybody over without any kind of suspicion. But even still, I don't think courts would really get in the way of that probably too much. So, but as far as these gubernatorial orders go, so long as they are pegged to travelers coming from certain jurisdictions and not pegged on residency requirements, I don't think there's a constitutional problem.
Where, like, if this thing was an order of magnitude worse, what could the government actually do as far as forcing people to stay in their homes?
Well, I mean, I think just kind of like what you saw in Kentucky, right? You could have the police actually enforce a quarantine, or an isolation order. The problem is I think even though the government has that innate power or inherent police power, you don't. That's not what we want, right? What we want is people to be socially responsible, and I think that's not just a question of the individual commitment to the broader cause, but I think that's a question of leadership, right? We need our leaders to be individuals who are willing and capable and able of explaining to the public what their duty is and the rationale and justifications for it, and then to show when those kind of self-restriction on individual rights and liberties pays off. So I think that this is, again, I think that the power is probably there, but this is really, I think, a question of leadership and the ability of our elected officials to communicate. And a failure to communicate, I think, in these conditions is probably incredibly dangerous thing.
And let's talk about the business aspect of this just quickly. Basically, my entire client base has been closed down, operators of bars, restaurants, casinos, entertainment venues, et cetera. I think there's a dynamic coming. I'm not predicting this based on inside information, just reading the tea leaves, where if this thing drags on, you may see business groups start to agitate to open back up sooner. Do you foresee, presuming that the courts are available to litigate before, do you foresee any successful constitutional arguments from these local chambers of commerce, for instance, that may try to agitate and challenge one of these stay-at-home orders?
Zero chance.
And I am going to copy and paste this and send this to my clients, just so you know.
Yeah, that's fine. And the reason for that is because economic regulations, right, we generally rubber stamp them just so long as they have some kind of plausibility to them. It may not be a great rationale, but bare rationality is all that's required to regulate commerce and that's just always true. I think that'll be doubly true now in a situation when you have public health experts saying, no, don't open these things up because thousands upon thousands of people will die. I think a court would say, thanks for bringing this case, but I'm not touching it with a 40-foot pole. Now, I think what you will see likely is once these orders, once, for example, in Illinois, ours expires on May 1st, I think that you will have, what you will see is government being more nuanced, right? So we're going to kind of reach, kind of like how we ratcheted up to the point we're at now in Illinois, for example. We didn't start off with the 10 group gathering caps and all these businesses closed, right? We started with the, you can only have 500 people, and then it went down to 250 people, and then it was 100 people, and then it was 50 people, and then it became 10. I think what you are going to start to see is the reverse, right? So maybe the bars and restaurants can open up, but your max capacity is now 50 people instead of right? Even though you have a capacity of 1,000, you could still have 50, and then we're going to ramp it up to 100 and slowly kind of get back to a spot where you're not risking massive groups of people all at once. So I think there is some, I think the pain is going to continue for a prolonged period, but I think you're going to see governments act in a way that's nuanced and kind of just reverse engineered from the way we got to where we're at now. And if governments are doing that, I think courts will see the logic in it. And again, because it is an economic regulation, that's just going to be an open and shut case.
One of the issues I see with that, because I've thought a lot about what you say is a nuanced approach, right? And one of the issues is that you lose a lot in the messaging when a government is nuanced and it's trying to articulate those nuanced positions to an entire population, especially when you have a media that's kind of at least regionally, if not nationally, focused on this. So it seems like once you have like one large market that's basically saying, okay, all of the salons and the barbershops and the bars and we can open up, but we're going to cap it at 25 people and they all have to be 6 feet apart, right? It seems like if like Los Angeles does that and you're in Miami or you're in Chicago, like you immediately begin clamoring for the exact same treatment. So it's like as soon as a couple major markets give, everyone across the country, despite the difference in city or regional issues, are going to be immediately trying to push for that as well if you're running a business.
I mean, I think that's probably true. But here's the thing. I think what we need to recognize is again, this is a political communication problem more than a legal problem. Because if you look at some of the models, I mean, it is just absolutely true that Illinois' curve is going to peak before Florida's, and New York's curve is going to peak before Illinois' curve will peak, and so there's all these different questions about density and curve peaking and hospitalization capacity and the percentage of the population which is exposed. I think these are really difficult questions, and they will have different, there's probably no good one size fit all solution. And then you throw in things like antibody tests and can we get, younger people and those who've been exposed and those who've been recovered back into the workforce and into the commercial spaces. I think you're right that this is going to be very hard to manage. And that's why I think it's not just important to have local voices that are strong leaders, but we need a national voice too, and that's consistent and thorough and very transparent with the public. I think that's somewhat lacking right now, and that's also problematic.
Can I ask you one more related question, but not quite business? Just as a constitutional law professor, what type of impact on the legal community or just on society at whole do you have when you basically upend, I guess, discretionary court cases, basically the entire appellate process? You're basically picking that up and moving it 2 or 3 months into the future, and just you have this gap of a lot of the court system just not functioning. What do you see any unintended consequences from doing that?
I mean, it's hard to predict. I think that certainly the courts are able to adjudicate pressing constitutional questions. And to the extent that, for example, we've seen election litigation in the last 24 hours come out of Wisconsin and go all the way up to the Supreme Court and back. And so So long as the courts are capable of performing those functions, I think that's good. You do have a number of state Supreme Courts which have done, I think, a very good job about reducing prison populations and trying to get as many nonviolent offenders out of the system in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19, which I think is actually a really remarkable feat for a lot of these courts. And I wish more would do more in that sense too. So I think the essential functions are being done, right? I think people can still litigate their constitutional rights. Those who commit crimes will still be prosecuted and all the rest. There will be a backlog, and I think there will be certainly tough times ahead for courts to try to manage all that. But, at the same time, we're all in that same boat. So I don't think that that's, whatever downside and challenges that this time presents for the legal system. I think at this point, you just have to say it is what it is, right? Because we're all in it together, and that's just what we have to do.
All right, let's do our shout outs.
All right, wrapping up. Each week we do a shout out to people, institutions, content, anything else that we think is exceptional, entertaining, interesting. It's usually just our opportunity to kind of single out or highlight something that we think has been specifically impressive or particularly noteworthy during the last week. Do you have any shout outs to give, any people that you or places, things that have particularly impressed you over the last few weeks?
So I want to just actually give a shout out to, there's a group of law students who have volunteered their time and their skills to practitioners dealing with COVID-19 issues, all across the board, whether it's a criminal justice issue or housing or employment or benefits issues, insurance issues, and they've been giving up their time to contribute to making people's lives a little bit better and a little bit easier in the middle of this crisis. So I just want to give them all a shout out because I think that's really incredibly remarkable. And the legal world and legal profession is in good hands with folks like that, I think.
That's impressive. That's awesome. Because I think you and I both know people we went to school with that would probably be just hanging out, on their deck, getting some sun and drinking beers right now. So I appreciate the initiative.
Or tubing down a river,
right.
Which I would love to do myself.
Well, this was awesome. Thanks for your time.
No, thanks y'all for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, that's going to do it for another pod. Thank you again for tuning in and listening to the Regulated Pod. And Tony and I are trying to come up with some interesting concepts and ideas in order to just do our little part in order to produce stuff that we find interesting that you at home may listen to just go ahead and kill an hour. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and as always, stay compliant.